So today, first I should say, thank you again to all of our sponsors and also to NCMC for making this happen. It's been such a pleasure to be able to share all of this with you and to have a forum to uh, explore all these fascinating subjects. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Um, Week three, we're going to be talking about music at a crossroads, as I put it, um, which is to say, uh, hmm, hello? Okay, there we go. Music at a crossroads. So these various isms: neoclassicism, serialism, and modernism. And um, the main thing we'll be dealing with is music in between and after the world wars, because as you'll see, the war, both wars really affected the way that people dealt with cultural issues, and especially in the Second World War, the way that music was used by fascist regimes, sort of was annexed by those groups, by the Nazis, by the Italian Fascist Party, by Russia, as ways of sort of claiming national heritage on sort of a cultural icon. And then, of course, after World War One, there was a lot of anti-German sentiment, which seems to be the prevailing theme. Is we don't like the Germans in this course, but we're going to be also talking about the Stravinsky-Schoenberg polemic, this neoclassical, which is the Stravinsky side of things, versus the serial, which is the Schoenberg side of things. Serial being one of the techniques that is related to the 12-tone technique, which we will be talking about the 12-tone technique this week. As a reminder, last week we actually talked about three atonal works of Schoenberg, Berg, and Weber. And we'll also be sort of getting into this nitty-gritty of the difference between modernist versus avant-garde and versus experimental. So modernist being a composer who wishes to write in a modern, a contemporary idiom, but sort of be part of the classic or the standard repertoire. So let's say Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms. That would be a modernist. Avant-garde would be somebody trying to push the limits of what music can be, whereas an experimentalist is somebody who is trying new techniques or new technologies to incorporate into their music. And we'll be addressing all of these branches of music. So again, in neoclassicism, we have Stravinsky, we have Lacey's, and I've put on here Paul Hindemith, who is technically a different branch of music called New Objectivity, but we're going to be lumping him into neoclassicism for reasons you'll soon see. And then we have serialism. So we have Webern, who sort of after the Second World War becomes this shining light of contemporary music. And then the composers Boulez, Stockhausen, and Messiaen, and their outsized influence on that world, and of course, electronic music. So, let's see. For neoclassicism, now this is a trend that had been going on for quite a long time. Debussy had had planned to write, before he passed away, 6 sonatas in this sort of light classical or Baroque style. As had, Ravel had written Le Tombeau de Couperin, which is a set of 6 piano pieces in the style of a Baroque harpsichord suite. And even before then, Fauré was investigating music of the Renaissance, as was Debussy. But there had been this long tradition of interest in music of the past. And it was sort of at this point in time, after the First World War, that this all came to a head. More than anything, they wanted to purge Wagner from their system, this heavy German music. And also Debussy was kind of lumped into this category, this sort of mystical, luxurious style, in favor of a precise, clear, and objective music. And the result is an interesting kind of sort of distant cold music, which is not to say it's emotionless, but it is sort of almost like a beautiful object, like a decoration, like an ornament. It is related very much also to the artistic movement at the time, especially with Picasso. Um, and it's interesting, we see composers like Stravinsky, who for the first half of, or the first third of their career, had really dedicated their output to this Russian identity. We think of the Rite of Spring, Petrushka, and the Firebird. And what he does instead is he actually retroactively tries to distance himself from that. He effectively lies, saying, "Oh, no. There's like one folk tune in the Rite of Spring. It was all sort of separate from reality." And of course, this is completely false. There are dozen. I think there's got to be, I would imagine. Oh, there's at least a dozen of these individual folk tunes. So there's this again. This ties into what we call leisure culture or salon culture in Paris and in a lot of France. These sort of individual donors who would pick and choose their composers who they wanted to work with, and organize these sort of ironically luxuriant parties where you'd have some of this music, these brand new composers presenting this clear, objective music. John Cocteau, the writer, referred to this German romantic music as head music. Music that was so heavy you had to hold your head in your hands to listen to it. It was the weight of the world was crushing you. And again, this idea of I must emphasize, kind of ironic idea of this freedom from bourgeois decadence, which in fact that's who was paying the bills. But it was a desire to return, all things said, to pre-romantic music. And the way that they did this was, of course, not just borrowing from music of the past, but by the use of non-classical idioms, so jazz, non-Western music. We've talked about Balinese music before, but you'll see that there's going to be a lot more influences from Romania, from Africa, and of course from America. The vernacular music, so little ditties that you hear in the street, kind of like we heard with Petrushka, and musical, so operetta, light cabaret, this type of music, and layered all throughout all of that is also this idea of mass technology. So there's this group of composers known as futurists from Italy who aren't part of the neoclassical movement, but they are interested in the way that technology influences and affects the way that we listen to things. The idea of, we have recordings now, we have automobiles are more readily available. The way that culture is distributed more easily. These are all part and parcel of this movement. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what that sounds like. So here on the right, we have Mozart's 35th Symphony, Hafner. And we're going to listen to a little bit of the fourth movement here and compare it with a symphony by Prokofiev. So that is the first theme from Mozart's Hafner Symphony. Now, Prokofiev in 1916 and 1917 wrote his classical symphony, his first symphony, and it was supposed to be sort of a whimsical return to the styles of Haydn and Mozart. so it's almost like a potpourri of these sort of classical gestures, these big sort of arpeggios that become lyrical melodies, these little woodwind trills. It becomes, it's sort of a, it's whimsical. It's supposed to evoke a different style while also being very clearly of the 20th century. So let's now shift over to Stravinsky, who's although many of you may know him best for the 3 Russian ballets we talked about last week, the majority of his output was in fact neoclassical. And the first time that he came into contact with this style was in his ballet opera Pulcinella, which was from 1920 and commissioned by the Ballet Russe. And this work is actually not originally Stravinsky. It is his arrangements of what he termed works of Pergolesi, who was a early Baroque composer. But in fact, it's not just Pergolesi, it's a whole bunch of other composers, Locatelli, Gaio, and it's all these sort of Italianate works from it, and these delightful arrangements that he's done. Like sort of it's almost like he's taken the Baroque and recomposed it, much like Prokofiev took the classical era and recomposed it for the modern era in the 20s and the teens. And funnily enough, this keeps on cropping up here. It is a plot based on the Commedia dell'arte. This was just sort of a popular trope at the time, and was, I think, probably a great canvas upon which you could paint anything. It was almost like, and that's really sort of the philosophy of a lot of this neoclassical stuff. It is a salve for the Romantic style. It is just a blank slate upon which you can sort of start over. And there's maybe a little bit of this, may be a little psychoanalytical. However, it's sort of an escapist way of dealing with the horror that was the First World War, and many people have sort of thought about it in those terms, this sort of extreme departure from what had come before. Because what's interesting about this octet is that it is so un-Stravinsky in its material compared to what we had been listening to before. You know, before we were hearing, and instead, this is what we get. And this actually caused a minor hubbub at its premiere because people thought that Stravinsky was being regressive. And the whole movement in this particular case is designed off of that early Baroque overture, as you would hear in a dance suite. And the whole point of this piece, as was sort of summarized in his pamphlet, Some Thoughts on My Octour, which was this week's reading, from 1924, is that music is powerless to express anything. That music is truly an object. He refers to it in terms of its specific weight or its specific density, as if a music is made up of a certain amount of substance. And what he has done is he's sort of controlled the parameters for the music. He's used only woodwinds, which he views as more rigid than their more expressive or emotive, is probably a better word, cousins in the string department. And he is trying to make emotional interpretation not a variable in his music, so that he writes it clearly. He gives you what he wants. You don't have to do anything. You sort of hit play. It's almost like a mechanized form of music. And he argues essentially that emotional nuance deforms music. And what he's really talking about is it's German music. That's the stuff that's ruining. That's the stuff that's ruining music. It's the stuff that's ruining culture. And that what he's even more specifically talking about is Schoenberg. And so this control of affectation using Baroque models, which are couched in this style of affectation. The way that a Baroque suite works is that each dance is supposed to evoke a certain emotion, a certain affectation. And the key that a piece may be given is in turn also supposed to denote a certain type of emotion or feeling. And his argument here is that they had it right. Let's do it. Let's do it like this, and I'll give you all the instructions, and you just play. Don't there's nothing more to it than that. It's an object, and it's a way of making music tangible rather than these sort of heady, sort of philosophical debates that are heard in a lot of the German music that comes before, so Strauss, Mahler, Schoenberg. Now, of course, this had influence going forward, and we'll see especially this affected Darius Milhaud and Lessis. Now, in turn, they were inspired by the composer Erik Satie, who was a composer from, most famous for, I'm sure many of you know, his Gymnopédie. This sort of static, almost cyclical harmony was really quite. It was what gave him the title of the laziest student in the Paris Conservatoire. But it actually was quite influential amongst a lot of young composers, including Debussy, including Ravel, and including, of course, Lessis. And he was sort of this hero from this new era of music in the 1920s. He and Jean Cocteau, the writer who we were speaking of before, in addition with the Ballet Russe, they put on another one of these scandalous performances with a work called Parade, which was a ballet conceived about, it sort of deals with the relevance of music in the modern era, because it's about a circus troupe that, in an effort to get people to come to their shows, sets up a bunch of sideshows in front of the main act. But the sideshows are so interesting and successful that the audience actually never ends up going inside the tent, and as a result, it's sort of an implication that the lowbrow stuff, the stuff that's going on outside, is what's the real attraction. And this was upsetting to audiences in that time, especially towards the end of World War I when it was premiered. It was not, again, kind of like the Rite of Spring, not what they were expecting to hear. It's this lowbrow music that is heard in the score by Satie. And also, it's obviously sort of a depressing subject matter. The idea that this no longer matters, especially at a time that, like the end of World War I, where the world seemed like it was collapsing around them. And generally, Satie and Cocteau were extremely influential in the Dada and Surreal movements in Paris around the same time. But the musical side of this was Lessis. And these are the composers: Darius Milhaud, Francis Poulenc, Arthur Honegger, Germain Taillefer, Georges Auric, and Louis Duret. And especially the first three I named, Neo, Poulenc, and Honegger, are the best known of the group. And their intention, much like Stravinsky, was to gain freedom from what they saw as foreign influence. Of course, being predominantly German, but they also wanted to sort of strive for a uniquely French sound. They also, again, like I said, they did not want Debussy, and again, it was because of that sense of mysticism, that sort of cloudy, head in the clouds style. And what they wanted was instead music of the everyday. On the other hand, over back in Germany, we have the composer Paul Hindemith, who was born near Frankfurt and was a teacher and a composer and a violist. And his methods of teaching came to be very important after, long after his death, and were very influential in the sort of pedagogical sphere of early music education. And his early works, again, sort of paid homage to Strauss, Mahler, Debussy, the familiar three. But later on, he along with Kurt Weill, began this movement of what we call Neue Sachlichkeit, which is again the new objectivity, the idea of music for use. Which this is the reason why I paired Hindemith with Lecis in this movement of Neoclassicism, because it was about utilitarian music, music for every day, something that was relevant to the everyday layman. Later in his career, Hindemith was banned by the Nazis for a lot of sort of the lewd content of his earlier work. At the beginning of his career, he was a little bit more daring, and that did not pay him well once the Nazis took power. And he wound up fleeing to the US, where he taught at Yale for, I believe, a decade and a half. So first of these we're going to talk about is Milhaud. So he was born in Marseille, and he was actually Jewish. And so as a result, when the Nazis took power in France, he fled to the US as well in 1940, and where he wound up teaching at Mills College in Oakland in California. And he was an enormously prolific composer. I think he has something like 400, 600 opus numbers in a very diverse set of styles. It's interesting how many different hats Milhaud was able to wear. And it is an international style as a result of the amount of traveling that he did. For instance, he spent, I think, 1916 to 1918 in Brazil, and during World War I, and he sort of picked up all these different what would be normally termed lowbrow music, these sort of popular dances, popular songs, and he collected them and put them in a suite called Saudade do Brasil, which is just souvenirs from Brazil, remembrances of Brazil. And he, in order to sort of convey the mood, the sort of exotic mood that he wanted to evoke from Brazil, he started writing in a style that had been used before and known as polytonality, which is to say that he has two keys working at the same time. So he has, in this one that we're going to play from Botafogo, we're going to have two keys, F minor and F sharp minor. Of course, when you put them together, it's actually quite crunchy. But you'll see in the accompaniment, you'll have the F minor, very sort of standard, common practice harmony, but then you'll have in the melody these out of pitch notes. At the same time, there are many notes that actually cross over between the two keys. So it's not completely at odds with one another. And it's interesting to see how he makes that work. So that's one example of how he's using this kind of music. On the other hand, he actually wound up spending time in America. He visited Harlem in 1923, where he heard jazz, and he was completely taken by it. Jazz was very popular during the end of the teens, early 20s in France, and it resulted in what is sort of in retrospect, a kind of problematic genre of music known as art nègre, black art. And in this particular work that we're going to listen to, this is called The Creation of the World, La Création du Monde. It is a ballet that takes African creation myths. In the original, of course, the original ballet, there were designs and sets that were inspired by African masks. Picasso, incidentally, of course, took inspiration from many of these African masks for his Cubist paintings, portraits especially. And of course, jazz. And he sort of muddles it all together into this, this beautiful, beautiful work. But now, since we're keeping in mind this neoclassical genre, which you're going to, of course, learn right now, I've been talking about classical music, as in classical era, and Baroque, and using them together as neoclassical. As confusing as it is, most neoclassical music does reference both Baroque and classical. And so he's going to take elements of Bach and combine them with jazz, these two sort of completely distant musical ideas. And he's going to take this sort of jazz theme and turn it into a fugue. Now, a fugue is a type of musical composition where one single idea is overlaid upon itself in a contrapuntal manner, such that you'll have 5 instruments playing the exact same theme, and as it goes along, it becomes more thick. It's sort of different textures pop out, and it's a sort of a specialty of Bach. His art of the fugue and also the well-tempered clavier are essentially sets of fugues, where he takes different themes and he layers them on top of one another. So in the beginning, you're going to hear first the bass, the double bass, then the trombone, and so on and so forth, each introducing the theme. And what he's done here, I'm sure you also noticed, is that there's a saxophone sitting with the strings. He's replaced the viola of a string quartet for this particular ensemble with a saxophone to pay homage again to that jazz. So moving back over to Germany, maybe. We're going to talk about Hindemith. Now, the interesting thing about Hindemith is that, and this whole movement of new objectivity, is that very similarly to the neoclassical movement, it's interested in music of the past. in objective, affective music from the Baroque and the Renaissance, sort of eschewing the extreme emotions, the subjective emotions of Berg and Schoenberg. And it is, instead of a sort of rejection of German music, is actually very much an emphasis on German tradition. That's really where the main difference lies. And so what they wanted to do was similar to the neoclassical movement. They wanted to write clear, accessible music, art for the people. And this was, again, as I mentioned, Kurt Weill. It's sort of a musical, it's sort of an opera, the Threepenny Opera, is a depiction of, it's kind of similar to Wozzeck, it's a depiction of the poor and of the struggles of being sort of trapped in that situation. And what he did to convey what perhaps Wozzeck didn't to some, because of the sort of intensity of Wozzeck's music, is that he uses popular idioms. He uses music that you would easily hear in the music hall, in a cabaret. And the last element of this is Gebrauchs music, the music for use, utilitarian music. And one of the more notable proponents of this, aside from Hindemith, is Karl Orff, who wrote Carmina Burana. And Orff, along with Hindemith, is particularly notable for their work in Schulwerk, the music education system, which a lot of this stuff, these arts and crafts movements, this hunger for wholeness after such a kind of war, you know, the Bauhaus movement, all of this stuff, maybe in a sort of eerie way, reflects the collectivism that is present in a lot of the National Socialist Party. And what we're going to hear in these particular selections I have for you is early Hindemith and sort of late Hindemith. So this first one is his Ragtime from the 1922 suite. It is one of the pieces that would have gotten him in trouble with the Nazis, the degenerate Hindemith, and it's in no small part because of the jazz influence. You'll hear yet again everybody sort of picking up from the same cauldron, the same ideas. Everybody's interested in the same things. You can see between Les Six and new objectivity movements that they're interested in popular music. They're interested in jazz. They're interested in accessing the people. It's interesting. Hindemith was also known for his what's called quartal harmony. He based he based a lot of his music off of a very unusual interval. It sort of has that objective quality because when you hear, say, the essential interval we have here is this. This is a major third in this context. But if you say change that chord to, that is including 2/4. You're sort of you're not allowing it to have the sort of color that would make something sound like this or this, but instead there's very little difference in the actual notes themselves, of course, but this was an important part of his harmony, and you hear this quartal harmony in this particular work quite a lot. So the other thing that is interesting to note about Hindemith, of course, is that he talked about music for use. You know, he wrote a sonata for every single instrument. So it's part of what seems to be sort of a greater teaching tool or a contribution to you know, the everyday music student. Um, so later in his career, this is about 10 years later, we have this symphony Matthias de Mahler, and this comes from his opera, the Matthias Grunwald, which is about this Reformationist painter, and this particular painter's struggle with the politics of the time. And this was, of course, very clearly an allusion to himself struggling with the Nazis at that particular time. And what I wanted to play to you was the Engel concert from this Matthias de Mahler symphony. And the reason why I chose this particular work is because of the fugal writing. Now, you'll see in the Hindernis, I've given you a jazz-influenced piece, like sort of street music or music hall music piece, and then I followed it up with a fugal piece. And I'm going to do the exact, what I did before, of course, is that I've done the Mio with the Latin American music influence piece, the, again, street music, music hall music, with fugal music. And I want to just show you how these two completely different sounding musics do more or less the same thing. So now we're going to continue on to the other side of the coin here, which is serialism, 12-tone music. So 12-tone music comes from a period in Schoenberg's life when he was rediscovering his Jewish roots. As I told you last time, Schoenberg had converted to Lutheranism as a means to sort of assimilate into the German culture. But around the time that he was writing this music, there was very clearly a deep anti-Semitic strain that was bubbling up and would wind up being, let's say, a huge problem for Schoenberg and for many, obviously, the entire European Jewish population. Schoenberg would eventually flee to the US in 1933 for this reason. But one of the works that he was writing, which I think best reflects his sort of attitude towards the rest of the world, was this opera that was unfinished at the time of his death, Moses and Aaron. And he sort of, in a way, puts himself as the prophet, as an allegory for his sort of being the person that nobody listens to, the mad prophet who's doing this method, this crazy musical method that is the only way forward. Because that's how Schoenberg viewed it. He viewed it as this is the only, much like his free atonal music, he viewed this as the only way forward. And this is not exactly a new idea for him. They had been doing something similar to this for a very long time, but this is just a new codified method of doing this. So to clarify, uh, what 12 tone means is that, of course, it's a way of organizing the 12 notes of the chromatic scale in a hierarchical way. Because, of course, when you're missing in your music, you need a different hierarchy system because it is difficult to hear, say, or organize this music without it sounding essentially random. And even though it is organized, sometimes it's very difficult to hear. So let's just say here's our chromatic scale. But you can also organize those in a different way. For example, in Schoenberg's piano suite. The row that when I've just played it, that's what we call the tone row or the series, is the established hierarchy for the whole piece. So the succession of notes must happen in that order, either as a melody or in the harmony, before you can continue on to the next 12 notes. Now you can transpose this row, so you can play, instead of it can be, you can also play it backwards, so retrograde, or you can play it backwards. So you can play it upside down. So let's see. And you can also play it upside down and backwards, so inversion retrograde. Now, I don't expect you to hear all of this. It's truly just theory. But the important thing to know that's how they organized the music. Now, what's interesting about the 12-tone method is that in previous Schoenberg had forbidden the use of pre-existing models. So we're talking about these Baroque and classical models that we were just talking about with the Neoclassicists. So sonata form, rondos, dance forms from a Baroque suite. All of that was verboten. But now it is allowable. Not only that, but tonality is not forbidden. So you can actually write a tonal work in a 12-tone style. And I'll show you how that sounds in a second. The other thing is that it's sort of a demystifying of the Schoenberg free atonal period. It is an idea that everything is an expression of any emotion that you want. This 12-tone music can be used not just to describe these painful expressionist emotions, but happiness, joy, so on and so forth. And I think the important thing to understand here is that dissonant does not equal anger. It does not, well, that is to say, it does not by definition equal anger. It does not necessarily equal pain. And it's sort of a different way of thinking about this kind of music. It also doesn't necessarily mean aggression. And I'll show you here. You have on the top we have Glenn Gould, who is a champion of both Bach and Schoenberg's music. We have the Gigue from the French Suite No. 5, and we're going to compare that with the Gigue from Schoenberg's Piano Suite, from the tone row of which I just played you, which I'm sure you'll remember that. So there's Bach's Gigue, and here is Schoenberg's Gigue, again played by the same pianist. This is Glenn Gould. Now, the other interesting thing about all of this music is that it is an assertion of Austro-German pride. That's really what is at war here, right, between the Stravinsky-Schoenberg camps. But what is interesting is that they're still both looking back at music of the past and trying to find ways of reinventing it, even if they're doing it in completely different languages. Now, I said before that 12-tone music can be tonal, and I'm going to show you a couple different ways how that's true. So not all 12-tone music sounds like what you just heard. I'm going to go in order. We're going to listen first to Samuel Barber, the American composer's Nocturne, Opus 33, which uses in the melody a 12-tone. So what he's done is, of course, he's contextualized the tone row with something that sounds like, this. He's made it sound like it is in a key. It's not just related only to the other tones. That's the important thing about Schoenberg's music, is that these 12 tones are used only in relation to one another. The hierarchy is built upon their relationship to one another, which is why it sounds like that. Whereas here, he's taken those 12 notes, and he's playing all 12 of them, but he's also playing a big minor chord underneath all of that. Now here's Shostakovich, the Russian composer. This is one of the themes from his 14th symphony. So that first xylophone theme, I know, is very, very quick, but it sounds almost tonal. It implies that the place it's going to eventually is what? That it winds up going somewhere. Now, similarly, you can also take this Bill Evans 12-tone tune, where he has recontextualized these notes in chords that have sort of that same functional harmony that the common practice does. this is all to say that not all 12-tone music sounds the same. It's just like, just because Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms all use the same common practice style of harmony does not mean that all 12-tone music sounds like Schoenberg. Interesting thing to note. So now we're going to be talking about a very different kind of music, which is the sort of one of the more extreme types of 12-tone music, which is serialism. It's a type of music where essentially not only are the notes serialized, so the notes have to come in a certain order before you can repeat them again, but the dynamics are serialized. So piano, soft, pianissimo, very soft, forte, loud, fortissimo, very loud, mezzo forte, mezzo piano, the sort of soft, sort of loud. All of that is now serialized, so you can't repeat those dynamics. Each note is sort of assigned a given dynamic or a given order for which it must happen before it can repeat again. And then on top of that, rhythmic values are given that sort of serial combination. So you can only play a note that lasts 2 beats long once before you can play. You have to play the first, a beat, a note that is only 1 beat or 1.5 beats, and it just goes on from there. You've basically controlled all the variables that you possibly can that exist in music, and you can. It's almost like this is an oversimplification, but it's almost like you're putting it through sort of a calculation machine to get it to come out a certain way. And this is what Messiaen, the French composer, achieved in his modes of different values. The etudes, the rhythmic etudes rather. And here we see again the serialization of rhythmic and dynamic parameters. So what you're going to hear is that again, dynamics, notes, and rhythm must occur in a certain order before they can be repeated. And the result is, it's interesting, you'll see. So again, these are more etudes. These are not necessarily designed as performance pieces. They're almost like experiments in this particular case. It's not true of all of this kind of music, but in this particular case it is. Sometimes it can without intending to, sound almost random. And there is further sort of philosophy into that, which we'll get into next class. But for the moment, this is one of these sort of ultra serialized pieces. Again, that's the serialization of rhythm, dynamic, and pitch. Another person who was at the head of this was Anton Webern, who died, who was tragically shot accidentally by an American soldier after the war had ended. There was a curfew, and he went out to smoke a cigarette, and somebody thought that he was signaling some revolutionary, and he was shot. But after his death, his music, which was for a good while quite strictly 12-tone, he was viewed as a visionary, sort of as this once arcane composer became this beloved sort of prophet of the avant-garde. And so his music in this late style has an incredible internal logic. All this serialization stuff that we're talking about is incredibly logical. It's fractal-like in the way that it's constructed. But it's also extremely difficult to hear. It's hard to hear a palindrome or a double canon or any of these complicated processes if you have it written in this particular manner, where one instrument plays part of the note and then the next one takes over and then there's another one and then down here there's yet another. It's completely separated, these melodic lines. So you don't hear it as necessarily a continual product, but perhaps more like, I guess he akin, sort of puts it akin to seeing the beauty of a blizzard, this sort of blur of nature, this mystical experience. Lastly, we have Edgar Varese, who was a French composer who moved to New York in 1815. He was also influenced by the Italian futurist movement that we talked about earlier. And it's what some people have termed skyscraper mysticism. It's this idea that the life of an industrialized civilization is sort of the music of the future. And unusually, his music was actually very well received for what you will hear. It's kind of like Stravinsky without any of the folk, or you can really hear again the Schoenbergian elements. It is the philosophy inside of it is the inclusion of all sounds. I've written here the art of noise, and what he does is that he'll have, say, if you take in regular music, you may take a theme and develop it like. When Mozart takes that theme and he develops it, it's that's the limits of my piano. But what Varese will do is that instead of taking a theme, he'll take a sound mass and transform it. And what I mean by sound mass is that he'll have an entire brass section screaming at the top of its lungs. And that sound itself, that really high brass, will change. That'll be the thing that develops throughout the course of a piece. So it's more about timbre development. So the point of all of these influences, especially Webern, is that it was viewed as apolitical. We're talking about music post World War II, and music, for instance, Strauss in Germany, Puccini in Italy, Shostakovich and Prokofiev in Russia. All of their music had been essentially co-opted and annexed by the fascists, and it was viewed as tainted. And really all music from the traditional canon had been co-opted. Germany also took rather not just Germany, the Third Reich also took Beethoven and Wagner and sort of gulped it all up. And so a lot of this, the point of this music going forward is that Webern seemed apolitical. It was so alien. It was so unfamiliar. It was pure in a certain way. And it was uncompromisingly what it was. It almost had no relationship to anything that happened before it. Of course, this is not true, but this is how it was viewed. And that was the purpose of a lot of the serialist music from the European avant-garde, is that it was a complete rejection of the fascistic musical culture that was seen in these different regimes during World War II. So at the head of sort of the more softer side of this was Olivier Messiaen. And I say softer because he was not, strictly speaking, a serialist. He was the teacher of many of the serial composers, for instance, Ioannis Xenakis, Pierre Boulez, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. But he was never as radical as many of his students. He once referred to Boulez as like a flayed lion in the sort of the degree of animosity and rage that he showed. But Messiaen, on the other hand, was actually a very sort of, well, he was a devout Catholic. And for him, music was the language of God. And not only that, but specifically birds were the original music of God. And that will come into play later in his career. He was born in Avignon and studied with Paul Dukas, the composer of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, at the Paris Conservatoire. And at a fairly young age, he was given the position of the church organist at the Church of the Holy Trinity in Paris, which is a position that he held for all of his life. His wife was Yvonne Leroy, who was a very well-known pianist, actually famous pianist and champion of a lot of new music, including that by Messiaen and Boulez, many, many other contemporary composers for her. And one of the most notable, I guess, pieces of literature that he put out in his early career was kind of a response to Schoenberg's earlier Harmonielehre, the theory of music, a theory of harmony rather. And this is my technique of music, of my musical language. And it argues a number of fundamental things. First of all, that the major triad is part of sort of the God's divine harmony, this natural consonance, which is to say a major triad being. And the reason he argues that is because all notes contain the reverberances of many notes above them. This is what we call the harmonic series. So when I play this note, it also contains these notes. So there's that one. And it keeps on going infinitely. But what is notable about the harmonic series is that the first triad, or the first consonant harmony in the Western tonal practice, is a major triad, not a minor triad, not something necessarily that dissonant. It is a major triad. And so his argument, of course, is that this is the natural, this is sort of God's way of telling us this is the way that harmony should be. So even in his most dissonant and most complicated sounding music, it still kind of retains hints or direct allusions to consonant harmony. He's also known for his colorful and non-standard orchestration. He'll have, in one of the pieces we show, a sort of wind, a tiny little wind band that accompanies a solo piano with a very wide array of percussion instruments, especially the xylophone and the glockenspiel. And he's also known for this opulent style. Now that's very contrary to what the French were doing. When we think about Debussy and Ravel, and composers prior to them, they were against that opulent style. They were against Wagner. They were much more for this sort of reserved style. But in the case of Messiaen, no. He wanted to go in a much more sort of deeply sort of celebratory approach. He was also a synesthete, which meant that he sort of saw colors as, or rather, he saw sounds as colors. He refers in some of his movements of the Quartet for the End of Time to blue-orange chords. He refers to, I believe, E major as the red key. And on top of that, in this technique of his musical language, he actually wrote a series of modes of limited transposition, which is to say he wrote an entirely new scale book that he based his musical language on. Some of them are ones we've already talked about, the whole tone scale, octatonic scale, and also, funnily enough, the Salome scale that we had talked about. But this scale is a scale that makes its way into Messiaen's music, and a lot of this is sort of based on these symmetrical scales, where the crux of the scale, the very middle part of the scale, is exactly a tritone off, making it sort of this dissonant harmony that sort of belies all of this music. And this book was seminal in terms of sort of giving a new non-Schoenbergian way of thinking about musical harmony outside of the Second Viennese school. So one of his best-known pieces is the Quartet for the End of Time, which is an incredible work, but also an incredibly unusual work, as it was written in a POW camp in World War II, when he was captured as a medical orderly in World War II, and he happened to come across three instrumentalists: the clarinetist Henri Akoka, the cellist Etienne Pasquier, and Jean Laboulier, the violinist. And the first work that was created, which made its way into this quartet, was The Abyss of the Birds, which was originally written for solo clarinet. And Messiaen actually performed for the premiere of this work in the prison of war camp, and he was actually released fairly shortly after it was premiered. And it is dedicated to him, to the Angel of the Apocalypse, and it is this sort of kaleidoscopic set of 8 visions from the Book of Revelation. And it is not necessarily a doomsday work. It is, in fact, more of an ecstatic contemplation of the end of time. He invokes all these very pure, simple harmonies at the end of the work. The louange à l'immortalité de Jesus, the praise for the immortality of Jesus. It's an incredibly, this particular one, this is an incredibly gorgeous aria, essentially. But what's interesting about this work is the way that he interprets this line, "There shall be time no longer." The way that he does that is by using non-metric rhythm patterns. That is to say, when we have, for instance, we talked about this last week, about 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. But in this case, he completely throws that out and actually, based on these Hindustani rhythms, these rhythms from Indian classical music, he essentially foregoes any sort of time signature, these clear delineated beats, something that cannot actually be measured quite so easily. And the belief being that by releasing us from that constraint, we are going into time immemorial. So on the other hand, he also has this very, very complicated thing that I've written here, isorhythmic cycles that are juxtaposed. What that means is that he has each instrument in this first movement, the crystal liturgy, each instrument plays its own musical material in cycles. So they keep on sort of repeating the same general music, but they're cycling them at different rates. It's kind of like if I was playing two songs at once, one that was in written in three, like in that sort of 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3, and also I played. Obviously, if you were to play those at the same time, there would be, some parts where they aligned and where they missed. And that's the way that this is written. So in this crystal liturgy, the clarinet plays the blackbird, the violin plays a nightingale, the cello plays the more sort of ethereal or nebulous term, the halo of heaven, and the piano provides the woods in which this is all occurring. This is the morning before the apocalypse, which Messiaen refers to as the silence of heaven here. There's sort of this stasis, this harmonic stasis. Not very much happens in terms of direction. It's all just sort of this cloud of sound. Now, to get an idea of his opulent style, which I'm referring to, I have for you this picture of this painting rather of Dali's Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus. It's this sort of surrealistic Christian view or sort of interest, and this can be heard in his work, the Tarangolila Symphony, which is interestingly based on a non-religious myth of the Tristan und Isolde. And here we have the Joie du sang des étoiles, the joy of the blood of the stars. And it is this fascinating sort of extremely opulent, like we said, waltz in this very sort of tonal yet wacky sort of this familiar yet unfamiliar world that expresses the joy of cosmic love. It's again, it's very out there, and yet it's very clear when you hear this music, especially comparing it with the Dali. You'll notice this instrument en martinote that if you may not have seen it on the screen. It's related to a theremin. It's a type of electronic instrument. It's kind of a way of Messiaen being able to say hip and cool and stay up to the sort of in the avant-garde of what music was doing. Now, lastly, for Messiaen, I'm going to be showing you his bird call music. Now, this comes from a period where Messiaen was sort of concerned that he was not modern enough. He sort of was wondering if God really could be expressed so simply by, a major triad, which is obviously it's a simplification. But he was feeling out of date, and so he found a way of being modern by literally transcribing bird calls into music, and this is sort of all encapsulated in his work, Oiseaux Exotiques, Exotic Birds, for piano and small orchestra. It is basically a counterpoint of bird songs, this imaginary aviary in which birds from all over the world exist in this sort of enormous, ornithological construct. I can't even know how to quite describe it, but it's quite astonishing. It's even more fascinating when you compare it with bird songs, real bird songs. For instance, what's going on? Now listen to the cardinal. So here's the real bird. Here's the piano. it's remarkable. But he managed to transcribe these bird songs quite literally. Now, going on to the more serious serialists, the Darmstadt school, we have this sort of very extreme viewpoint of the way that music should be. It's an era of denial, negation, violence, and darkness, because this is sort of the reaction to World War II. It seems that joy and affirmation is a banal construct to many of these composers. That music must be apolitical, i.e., in the sort of this vein of Webern. And not only that, but there is no obligation to the audience. This was especially interesting because the Darmstadt School, these summer courses for new music, which actually still exist today, were supported by the CIA because they were seen as a pro-democratic institution, which again, ironically makes it by definition political. And of course, to be against fascism is in and of itself political. So the one of the proponents of this was Theodor Adorno, who wanted this radicalized version of Schoenberg and was an enormous critic of neoclassicism. These guys were vicious towards Stravinsky and many of his comrades. And the thing is that it sort of became a parody of itself. There was this idea of perpetual revolution, that everything is abstract, that everything is scientific. You can kind of see it in the way that they titled their pieces. The neoclassicals would call their pieces things from of course, the classical and Baroque era: the sonatine, concertino, sinfonietta. In the Darmstadt school, you start seeing these sort of mathematically oriented titles: structures, syntaxis, music in 2 dimensions. It's a very different way of approaching music. And one of the most important composers was Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who was born in Cologne. His father was involved in the Nazi military, and his mother was actually exterminated while she was convalescing in a hospital. So she was viewed as essentially useless material. And his early training was fairly conventional. He went to the Hochschule für Musik in Köln and had sort of an interest in jazz. But throughout his career, he had many different stylistic interests. He was interested in aleatoric or sort of indeterminate music, serial music, as we discussed, electronic music, and spatial music. That is to say, music for which where you place it in the whole is important. As you'll see in one of the next pieces we're going to discuss, he had this electronic piece where you had to have 5 speakers set up in the room, so where the music was heard throughout the 5 speakers was important. And he was also quite an eccentric man. He, towards the end of his life, claimed that he was from another planet, and he had all sorts of very controversial views. For instance, he believed that, to put it very poorly, the way that I'm going to explain it, he viewed that 9/11. He was alive during the terrorist attack. He viewed that it was a version of art, sort of the greatest work of art for all of the people involved. Obviously, these types of controversial ideas gained him some sort of reputation. And what his sort of most important early piece is Kreuzspiel, which involves this combination of jazz and serial process. But one of his biggest contributions really was in electronic music, because there were 2 schools of electronic music. There always has to be division somewhere. There's the German school with Werner Meyer-Eppler and Herbert Eimert in Cologne, who believed that electronic music should only be synthesized sounds that exist in a vacuum, that are created by the technology they have. And the French school, musique concrete music, with Pierre Schaeffer and Edgar Varese. These were natural sounds, sounds that were recorded in the real world and sculpted to create something new. The thing about electronic music is that it was made possible by all these new technologies: tape recorders, oscillators, which are types of synthesizers, And this splicing technology, so that you could take magnetic tape and put them in, rearrange things you've recorded and put them in order. You can only imagine how many hours this took. And it was this labor-intensive laboratory setting that gave this sort of collegial scientific feeling to the process. It also meant that complex performance needs were nullified. Some of this music is intensely difficult, that was meant for live players, but having an electronic means that this hard stuff doesn't even matter. So Karlheinz Stockhausen's most important electronic piece, which is considered a masterpiece of this genre, is Gesang der Jünglinge, which is Song of the Youths. It's a as I said, a multi-track work which blends real and electronic sounds, so that you can kind of see that they are seamless. One thing becomes another, and you don't quite know what is what. And it, in this way, combines those two schools, the French and German schools. It is taken from recordings of a young boy singing "Praise the Lord" in German, and and the electronic imitations of those of that vocalizing. This piece was inspired by the story of Nebuchadnezzar's sons, who were punished for not idolizing the golden calf, and were tossed into a fiery pit only to be saved. And their praises of rejoice that they were saved. Now, this particular score that I've picked is interesting because it is a visual representation of orally what's going on. So you can kind of have another way of thinking about it. The blue lines that you see will be vocal. The orange ones are electronic, and gray is white noise. Lastly, Pierre Boulez, who is, let's just say, a force to be reckoned with. He was born in Montbrison in France, and he actually studied high mathematics in addition to his musical pursuits. His attitude was antagonistic and uncompromising. His obituary, Schoenberg is dead, was a harsh denunciation of Schoenberg. You remember we were talking about how Schoenberg had a sort of advanced musical language that he then used classical forms with. Now, that was anathema to Boulez. It should have all been new. He was using what was dead, the idea of using old forms. And Boulez would constantly interrupt concerts of Stravinsky, of these neoclassicists. And he had he basically had a contest in his early life, had a very testy relationship with everyone he came in contact with. As I said, he was a student of Messiaen, and his early style was sort of this fanatical, almost rage-like content. Again, total serialism. So pitch, rhythm, and dynamics are organized and must be repeated. Must complete a repetition before moving on. There are no forms, no known forms. There's generally little lyricism. And as he often writes in his scores, sans nuance, no nuance, sort of mechanized music again. And what winds up happening is it becomes this sort of constant barrage, this flux of notes that you can barely tell what happened before from what's happening now. It's this sense of you're just constantly here. You're always here. The music is unfolding in real time. And in the later era of his music, the 60s, he adopted more of that Debussy style. He abandoned the 12-tone process, but continued with this serialized process, and had this sort of interesting Orientalist twinge. Lots of sort of influences from Bali and from Java. These sort of metallic sounds. Now, for an example of the early style, we have structures. This is featuring Messiaen's wife, Yvonne Leroy, and Boulez.
Pierre Boulez brachte in diesem Jahr einen zweiten Band seiner Structure pour deux pianos. Hier probte mit Yvonne Leroy.
As you'll notice, Boulez there is conducting as he goes along. That's because he actually was a conductor. That was probably the most important part of his career moving forward. He was a conductor up until his death in 2016, and known for being extremely meticulous. As you can kind of hear, this style it's elusive, it's enigmatic, it's extremely ordered, and yet it because of the constantly changing parameters, it's hard to kind of hear what he's doing. What happens is when he moves later on, he tries to explore a systematized method plus this expressive element, giving it sort of a softening of it. Last but not least, we have an interesting story in Stravinsky. Now, he ultimately switched sides here on the neoclassical 12-tone debate. He wound up writing serialized music. He, throughout this whole process, was being viciously attacked by many of these serialist composers as being regressive, as being behind the time, as being no longer relevant. And he actually had a breakdown with when he was working with one of his friends, Robert Kraft, the conductor. And Kraft had recently reintroduced Stravinsky to Webern and Schoenberg. And Schoenberg by this point had passed away. And so maybe there's sort of this sense that Stravinsky finally had the green light that you can actually go ahead and do this. By actually at that point, all the members of this second Viennese school were dead, Baird, Webern, and Schoenberg. And he finally started dabbling in this serialist style. And one of the most important first works that he came out with was Agon, meaning contest. It's his one of his most important ballets that was choreographed by George Balanchine, and this is generally considered to be Balanchine's masterpiece. It's a complete reinterpretation of the 12-tone language, and he thoroughly sort of digests and makes it his own. It sounds like nothing else that we've heard today because of that. And it is divided into 12 sections and is danced by 12 dancers. All sort of makes sense. And it is inspired by the Apologie de la Danse, which is the 17th century dance manual from France that sort of explains and gives instructions on posture, on how to dance these moves, how to conduct yourself, so on and so forth. And it is a mixture of style and sound. It incorporates all of these elements from the Renaissance, from the Baroque, and from the Rite of Spring. It's interesting. The Apologie de la Danse refers to the fact that many of these dances used to come from pagan festivities, and might be a little bit of a sort of a coming full circle from the Rite of Spring, from the pagan festivals of the Rite of Spring, to the Branles-Leguet from Agon here. So with that, I conclude our discussion here tonight. Thank you. I know I kept you a little bit longer than promised. But if there are any questions, now's the time. This is such a sort of dense and interesting part of music history. It's a lot to take in. So well, I think that we can call it a wrap. Thank you very much for all coming, and thank you for enjoying this as much as I do.